Okay, good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Monday, November 23rd Finance and Operations Subcommittee meeting. Doctor, do you want to put the agenda up, or how would you like to
Yes,
proceed?
I can do that.
Thank you. So while Dr. Hackett is bringing up the agenda, we will continue our discussion as we started last week, talking about our full return in person on January 4th. And Dr. Hackett has a presentation to share just to show how we're going to approach this and the different pieces of implementation that we're going to talk about. So, oh, it looks like we need to approve some minutes first. Yeah, sorry.
It's all right.
I got ahead of us.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
I'd like to make a motion that we accept the November 16th minutes as they've been given to us.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, we'll do a roll call vote. Ms. Saros,
Aye.
Mr. Devon,
Aye.
and the chair votes aye. That's unanimous. And then it looks like the next thing on the agenda, so I did step ahead of us a little bit, sorry about that,
No worries.
is the second review of the approval of the student activity accounts. So did anybody have any questions after last week's meeting?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Mr. Devon?
Thank you, sir. Through the chair. And it's in what we're attempting to do here, I believe, going into perpetuity there, we will make, I'd like to make a motion that our designated years be put forth as years of graduation accounts. I think this will help us rather than going through freshman, sophomore, junior, which change on a yearly basis. I believe by going a year of graduation, it'll fine tune things and streamline things. So I'll make that motion if I may.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion before we move to a vote? Okay, Dr. Hackett, and you're fine with that designation, that change?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, all right, so I will call for a vote, roll call. Ms. Saros,
Aye.
Mr. Devon,
Aye.
and the chair votes aye. That is unanimous. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the review of the calendar for school year 2020, 2021. And I know, Dr. Hackett, you did send that out as part of the packet. So did anyone have any questions on the committee? Or Dr. Hackett, did you have any commentary on that?
Just a few comments. As you recall, I'm sure, which feels like 17 years ago, but the calendar that we approved for this year, the school committee approved for this year, only really kind of runs through the end of December. We left January through June kind of unapproved for just to see how things were going. I think that from our perspective, we don't see any need to change what that calendar looks like as presented right now for January through June. I mean, I think we had talked at one point about the February vacation, the April vacation. We're going to do something different with any of those. I think likely people have probably had enough shifting and change. So it would be my recommendation, and you don't need to do anything with it tonight. I just wanted to get it on your radar to go back then to the full school committee for at some point for approval for the remainder of the year. So one of the things that we need to talk about a little bit, if you will indulge me, is the issue of snow days. As you saw, there was an article recently. They did call me, and I didn't get back to them. But how we treat our snow days this year, I've gone back and forth in my head because in-person learning is pretty precious right now. The idea of giving up potentially days for in-person learning for snow days, it was, I could make an argument in one side of my head that really isn't a good trade-off. But at the same time, given the fact that this is going to be kind of a rough year, it's going to be kind of a rocky year, it would seem to me, and pretty consistent, I think, with most other school systems around us, that if we have a snow event, that we would go to full remote and treat it like a blizzard bag day. You know, that I'm not necessarily sure that really needs school committee approval. Obviously, it just deserves a conversation, and approval's fine, but the superintendent does make the call on snow days, but it is a little bit different. So, and we can do that. It's acceptable by the commissioner for this year. And I just guess I wanted to get your thoughts on that. You muted, Mr. Carter.
Muted.
Oh, any discussion from the subcommittee?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir, Mr. Devon.
thank you through the chair. Well, we know if we've, with this, the COVID situation and full remote and some of the other things that we're doing, I think there's more than a few districts that have basically come to the conclusion, whether they're making the votes on it is another thing, but that snow days going forward are gonna kind of, shall we say, fade away. I think because it does a few things for us. One, next year when we get back to normal, because right now the people that want to call this a new normal, I refuse to call this a normal. This is not. When we get back to, the way things were before, even a short year ago, with our increased technology, with the learning curve that our teachers and administration have gone through, that it's going to render snow days a moot point. And what does that do? It lets us, shall we say, end school, and it says here, June 15th, which I don't know how we've done doctor in the last several years, but I don't remember us making that, due date. So I do think it helps us get to those types of, gets us through a schedule that is more applicable going forward. That's just my opinion. I look forward to hearing from others how they feel.
Thank you, Mr. Devon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any
Mr.
other
Chair?
comments? Ms. Saros?
Yeah, I keep going back and forth on this also. I just think that the snow days we can definitely do, not the fully remote, definitely for these kids. I know we don't need to keep the kids online all day, but even the majority of the day, a snowstorm, we know a week ahead of time if it's coming. It's not like it's going to be overnight. Oh no, a snowstorm's tomorrow. We'll know it's coming. Teachers can prepare in that week. This is what, if we do call it, it can be called the night before and the kids will be prepared. Hey, we're going to be online this time. This is your schedule for the day. I just think we definitely can move away from what a snow day used to be and have a hard line end of the year.
No, thank you, Ms. Saros. I agree with both members of the subcommittee. I think, and I agree, Mr. Devon, that using the word new normal doesn't always have the right connotation. But I think maybe, the way that it does apply to this is that now that we understand how to execute a remote type learning situation, or as Dr. Hackett mentioned, a blizzard bag, does make a lot more sense to have more of a hard stop of the end of the year instead of a kind of floating stop. So I agree with all the members of the subcommittee, and I guess we can, if we meet next week, Doctor, we'll call this a first reading and we can look at it again on Monday before the school committee meeting and take a vote then, if that's the will of the subcommittee.
Here, here.
Okay,
I'm in agreement with that, Mr. Chair.
thank you. Dr. Hackett, are you all set?
Just one more thing I want to put on your radar. Within the last couple of weeks, and actually, I believe it was last week, there's been some movement, some decisions made by the MIAA for athletics and winter sports. And that is an item that I want to bring to the full school committee on Monday night. I say it in the context of the calendar because of the fact that athletics has shifted. As you know, the fall season for some sports was delayed. They kind of added the fourth season, but they have made the determination to hold the winter season, not necessarily completely as scheduled, but during a time when it normally would be scheduled. So I just want to put that on your radar. And I also want to put on your radar the fact that, if you can believe it, we are now talking about kindergarten, full day kindergarten registration for next year. We are planning to move forward as we normally would, with a few exceptions. One, we will not do the in-person registration, the 3 days that we've done prior to, with Marianne Cadre, who's organized that, and the admin assistants have done a great job along with the principals. We held those sessions over at Manadequate, and everyone came in, they got registered, and we obviously are not in a position to be able to do that. But the good news is, with the help of Andrew Marin, and Tech and Rebecca Kidwell, we are now able to utilize a registration software, so we can do our full day kindergarten registration online, and you'll be seeing some information coming out about that process soon. So, with respect to the calendar, that's it for me.
Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate it. So I believe we are now back to planning for January 4th, full in-person learning.
Okay, let me just call it up, please.
Thank you. And hopefully my screen will stay every time you flip to, there we go.
Okay,
I
you can see it?
I got it.
All right. So tonight really is kind of built, this slide deck is built off of the discussion we had last time, about kind of what are the big chunks, what are the buckets. This is really kind of a little bit of a plan-to-plan document, but also we've gone through and tried to identify some of the challenges. We have 4 categories that we've talked about. We know that the goal is to return students to full in-person learning, pre-K through 12, for January 2021. That I just want to make the note that we're, of course, maintaining the fully remote option as part of this planning process. And you kind of landed, I should say, last time on, at least this is kind of how I heard it, 4 planning areas: facilities, staffing, transportation, and health and safety. So what for me, just kind of bringing you through this, these are your own words, and I'm making sure that, this kind of syncs up with how you're thinking about it. We identified some main drivers, we're calling them, for this work, for making this plan. The first and foremost is that we would need to reduce the physical distancing from 6 feet to something less than, and we cannot go any less than 3 feet. So presumably it would be 3 feet. We are making a determination to essentially eliminate the cohorts with a full return plan. How we staff it and accommodations that we may have to make for staffing as provided under both federal and state legislation. That's obviously a driver for us. Transportation, as we've talked about this before, and related to number 1, we would really need to talk about reducing the physical distancing so that we can get a higher capacity on our buses. Now, that doesn't have to happen. We can certainly do, we could go full in person and not reduce the physical distancing on our buses. But I think we all know that if we can make that move, that we would be able to get not only more kids, but we'd be able to potentially bring kids in who may not be able to get to us because of transportation. And again, this is not exhaustive, but this is for your discussion, because I know there's more. Operational considerations. We have to think about our remote learning students. How do we service those students? It's a little cleaner at a couple different levels than it is at other levels, but as we've talked before, the high school staff is actually providing remote learning for the students who are fully remote, in addition to what they're doing within the classroom. I think we just have to keep an eye on custodial services. I feel really good about where we are right now. We've been able to hire additional custodial long-term subs this year. All accounts are that this custodial staff's doing a great job keeping things disinfected, but we are talking about bringing more kids into the building, and they're going to be there for a longer period of time. So hitting those high-touch services, we just need to at least have the conversation about that in and around that to make sure that we're in good shape to do it. Implementation timing with school schedules, and Mr. Lee can talk a little bit about this, but kind of, where we are in a semester, it matters for certain grade at certain levels. It's less of a concern at other levels, but we need to keep that in mind. Food service, obviously, and then student movement within and outside of the building. So tonight, we were really talking about facilities. This slide is a blast from the past. Can anyone tell me when I presented this?
I thought it was August. Was it
Oh,
August?
God.
This was in February, which seems to me like it was
Oh,
2 years ago. This was in and around the conversation we were having about if South Middle School did not pass and how we might reconfigure and realign our schools. So, but it's a good slide. This is give you some data on square footage of our buildings, as well as the classroom count. And, we have, obviously, East now is online, and these are the capacity at South of about 36 classrooms. That does count the modular units. And I show you that really to kind of get into this conversation, because this is the critical decision point. If we're going to return full in person, then we would be looking to reduce to a 3-foot physical distancing. There is a calculator that gives you a rough idea, or a pretty good idea actually, of how many students you can get into a classroom based on the square footage of the room, as well as based on the physical distancing that you're looking to put in place. So just in rough terms, you can see that if we have a 650 square foot classroom, it's approximately 8 kids. 750, 22, 850, 25, and 1200 27. So 1200 square foot classroom would be some kindergarten spaces, or some of our science labs. And obviously they're estimates, because we know every room is different, where the doors are, whether or not it's truly a rectangular shape, or whether there's a wall that comes in at a slant. There's a lot of variables within different classrooms that may affect those numbers, but at least gives us a decent idea of approximately what we can be looking at. So with that, we kind of identified, and I think, in our minds, some of the facility challenges that we face. One is the building capacity, not just the capacity.
oh.
Frank froze up.
Thank you, froze, Dr. Hackett. Mr. Lee, are you still active?
We
It might
lose
be that-
both.
I think
It
we
might be
lost
that
him.
building.
I guess his facility has a challenge. The slide is appropriate.
Yes.
So that's a
Oh. Oh,
He's probably going to have to try and
reboot.
reboot up with us.
Yeah, I think here he is.
Should we let him in?
Welcome back, Dr. Hackett.
I'm back. Phew.
We lost you at hello.
I'm
sorry.
I'm a little out of breath. I'm not quite sure where you lost me, but the classrooms, the size of the classrooms, how many kids we can get into those rooms is a challenge for us in some places. Core spaces, we know we're undersized in cafeterias and other core spaces at certain schools. We're finding that we're really bumping up against small group instruction and support space issues. Primarily, as I mentioned to you last time, I believe we had this conversation, as special education and the need for special services started to grow, school districts like us, including us, started having to carve up general classrooms to provide small group instructional spaces. Sometimes that carving up resulted in the HVAC ventilation system being in one space and not in the other space that got carved out. So if that space doesn't have any kind of mechanical ventilation, and if we do not have a window in that space, our position has been we're not going to use it for student instruction. So there are some of those that we still, that we have to factor into this planning as well. Class sizes and impact on scheduling. And Mr. Lee can speak a little bit more to that. And then the cafeteria availability and the capacity of the cafeteria, if we're going to be feeding students in school. Mr. Lee, do you want to maybe go back and talk about, let me see.
Get dizzy.
Sorry. Can you talk a little bit about just kind of from a scheduling perspective, some of these bullet points?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Dr. Hackett. So, classroom space is probably one of the biggest considerations that we need to take on. If we assume that we want to compress the cohorts into one group again, we have to take a look at how many kids can we get in a given room. And so if I use an example, for instance, South, I can have a math class that presently in cohort A has 11 kids in it. And then on cohort B, it has 12 kids in it, which in and of itself is not a problem for us right now. But when we go to combine them together, obviously now we're at 23. And if, Dr. Hackett, you jump to the next slide.
This one?
The rooms at South are between the 650 and 750 that we're looking at. And so in neither of those scenarios can we actually get that whole class into the room. So that's something that, as we think in terms of a schedule, we have to consider to see how many, if we combine the cohorts again, can we get them in the rooms? And there are certainly some options. There are larger spaces within, for instance, South, in all of our other buildings as well. So, but we would have to look at in terms of moving those classrooms to those larger spaces to be able to accommodate the larger numbers. So each building has its own set of challenges in this regard. Our cohorts at the elementary level are fairly consistent in terms of their size. East, the rooms are larger given the new construction, so we have some more flexibility there. And the high school has a wide variety of room sizes. So there's options in terms of what we can do. But as we think about scheduling, this is a major consideration for us. I can go back to the previous slide, please. As Dr. Hackett mentioned, our need for small group instruction spaces, particularly around special education and related support services is huge. As we bring kids back into the building on a more full-time basis, we need to be able to provide those services to them. But most importantly, we need appropriate spaces to do so. You don't have to go back too far to remember some of these things being done in hallways. We want to avoid that. So getting as many of these small group spaces online is important to us as we consider services related to instruction. So cafeteria availability and capacity is another big driver in terms of what we're going to be able to do. We have to, if we're going to have the kids in the building all day long on a normal scheduled day, we have to feed them. And taking a look at how you would do that really relates to how many lunches would you have to run. Now, each site has a cafeteria or gymatorium or whatever you want to call it of various size. So some could almost maintain their existing number of lunches that they had pre-pandemic. Others would have to increase that number of lunches being served throughout the day. And what we have to be cautious of is having so many lunches that we actually can't deliver the academic program. So again, each building is unique in this regard. The size of each cafeteria space is important to us. And these are numbers we're crunching as we're going through the process of figuring out how to best schedule back in person on a daily basis type work for our students.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. So, all of this is doable. We've obviously we're not starting flat-footed. Mr. Lee's leading up to some scheduling work and looking at different options for what would it look like from a scheduling perspective. We've done some work in and around transportation. We know our facilities are probably in the best shape they've been in for many years from a ventilation HVAC standpoint. We still have some challenges. We obviously also know that not every student's going to, we're planning for a full in-person return, knowing that we're still around 30% of our students are full remote, plus or minus, depending on the building and the level. So that is also for us a kind of a key or a driver for us is full remote, because it was one thing when we said to parents, your children can go either hybrid or full remote, and we had a lot of that when we thought we're going to be in hybrid that went full remote and it flipped our schedule around and created issues. It would be even worse scenario if we said we're coming back full in person and people who are full remote don't indicate, or we don't know what they're going to do, and then they come back full in person, because obviously from all the because of the distancing, that would create some significant challenges for us. So we have to have some kind of a controlled reentry plan. And, you know, we can talk about, like, have a few ideas on it, but I mean, the point being that we really have to make sure that we are controlling the reentry of students who are in full remote if they decide to come back to us full in person. So, Mr. Chair,
I think he may have frozen again.
I think he was giving
I
it back
believe
to
he
you.
was. I believe he was going to say, Mr. Chair, I'm going to give it back to you. So
Yeah.
I'd like to open it up to the subcommittee for questions and comments.
It looks like Jim's frozen too, and I had a question for him, so.
Okay, we'll give him a minute to get back. Just while we're waiting for them to come back live, just so all those that are attending the meeting on the outside, just to let you know, our purpose and our vision of how we go forward with this is to discuss each one of those areas that Dr. Hackett mentioned earlier, and not really try to come to a decision at this point, but just try to understand the challenges and the opportunities and what's going to have to happen in order for us to be successful to meet the January 4th date. So we want to understand each one of those things and kind of talk through them, so that when we get to the end of this process and we recommend the best way to do this to the full committee, that we'll have looked at each one of these key areas and we understand the challenges that we have and how we can, you know, if we can help solve any of those challenges, how we do that. So Dr. Hackett, I don't know if you are back live again.
I think I am. Can you hear me?
Okay, and Mr.
All
Lee?
right.
Okay,
Come back.
so I opened it up to the subcommittee, and I believe Ms. Saros has some questions, so
Yes,
all yours.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. Do we have a number of classes, or are you still working on that would have to be moved to larger spaces when the cohorts are combined? Or is that something you're working on now to figure out?
That's something we're working on right now. As I said, I can tell you right now, there are classes at the high school that are larger than we'd be able to accommodate. So we're looking at what the impact there would be. Certainly itself, it's a problem. And, you know, at each elementary school, there are pockets of issues that we'd have to deal with. But I don't have a concrete number to give you right this second.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, Ms. Saros?
Nope.
Okay, Mr. Devon, did you have anything?
Well, I got a couple of comments, and they're almost clarifying comments, that as much as, you know, we're working certain plans and whatnot and trying to be very creative as always. And I believe, if I'm correct, I think this is plan 14 or 15 that we've had since last year. The things that I find glaring are the fact that we're going to have to figure out how we're going to adjust spacing on our buses. So our transportation is a bit of a bottleneck. And the fact that some of our classrooms, in spite of the fact we've rendered them useful because we've done all the different testing, air exchange rates, all things that go with that, but it's the physical layout that winds up being a bit of a bottleneck too. And another thing that I find glaring is, how do we ensure safety during any and all lunch protocols? Those are the things that I see as being problematic. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Devon. Mr. Lee or Dr. Hackett, any comments?
I mean, I think Mr. Devon hit it. I mean, those things are all going to be challenges that we're going to need to work through. And the other thing that, we need to think about too is that we include our special education students in the general ed classroom too. So when we start talking about these numbers, we need to make sure that we're allowing for the inclusion as we normally would do for those students who have that as part of their program as well. And I think that, you know, while we do collect and figure out the number of classrooms that would exceed, with the cohorts combined, would exceed the size of a room, obviously then the question becomes, then how do we manage that and where we put them? Then we're going to be, you know, likely into discussions around using, for example, the high school, the media center, which we're using now for when we have quarantine staff and students who aren't quarantined, to bring them together to supervise and instruct in different courses. You know, we're going to have to start looking at those spaces, not just at the high school, but at the other schools as well. So, but again, I cannot really stress enough the importance of the remote learning controlled reentry, that we've got to know where we start on day one with our numbers. We just can't, we would not be able to do this without that parameter put in place.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hackett. I do have a couple of questions and a couple of comments, if you'll indulge me. So one of the things, and I think it may be your next slide. Yeah, I think it's that one, the one before, the previous one. Just to give us some perspective, what was a classroom capacity pre-COVID?
Well, in general, when you say capacity, we're talking our largest classes, 30. You know, we might have one or two at the high school that might bleed over that by one or two. But in general, we average probably between 22 and 25. But we have classes at both middle schools and the high school that would exceed that, pushing towards 30.
And what distance did we make? Do we know what the distance was that we maintained then?
In some of our buildings, I think of South in particular, you're probably talking less than 18 inches.
Okay, thank you, that makes sense. As far as the small spaces go, I know we talk a lot about flex space, right? And we certainly don't want students in the hallway and things like, and specialists moving carts up and down the hallway. So have we thought about how we would use flex spaces, auditoriums, gyms, you know, lobby, you know, open areas in the high school, for example?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, we haven't gone through the exercise of building those into a schedule or looking at what classes would make the most sense, or exactly how many would be able to get into the media center, cafeteria. With cafeteria for feeding, we would not be able to use. But we've had the conversations. That would be the next step. A lot of it would depend on what do we really need, because I think we're probably going to run into more is what Mr. Lee described, with the cohorts combined and a particular section of a class is actually over that number. One, is there a way to look at the schedule and figure out how to solve that by scheduling differently, offering another section of that course or something along that line? And then two, if that's not the case and we can't make any other kind of accommodation, then we have to have the right number of spaces that class would then just take place in a different part of the building where we can accommodate that number of kids.
Okay, because I think, I mean, again, we obviously don't have the luxury in January of outdoor space or doing anything outdoors. So I think it would be a good exercise just to understand if we need additional classroom space and small spaces, you know, what does each building give us for those kinds of spaces that make sense, you know,
Right.
and you can kind of tie that into the discussion about lunch. You know, certainly as we look at what a schedule looks like, if we decide that we want to use those spaces for learning, we may, you know, make a different decision about how we deliver lunch, correct?
That's correct. Yep, that's correct.
Yeah. And then I think, you know, at the high school level and probably a little bit at the middle school, I know there's great concern about having students move in the hallways from class to class. And, you know, I know that's a really big challenge, and we've talked about it quite a bit, you know, over the last couple of months, that we can't necessarily keep students in in a cohort or in a group when they have other subjects that they may be in at different levels. So I think that's another, another complication that we have to look at is, do we have a way to move a minimal number of students out of that cohort and still deliver, the education and the schedule that we need to? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that would be another question, right?
Definitely, coupled with and somewhat related to the fact that we have we've got about 600 plus students in full remote right now at the high school. And again, just not to repeat myself, but our high school staff is delivering the full remote program. We've made that, commitment to do that because we didn't want to put it off on an online program. We want to make sure that our kids were getting our teachers. If we're in full day with staff, then that's going to have to look, somehow it's going to have to look different. So, there are a few different options we can look at, but we've got to figure that out.
Okay. And again, on the lunch piece, I think we all have voiced the same concern. Obviously, that's a time inside the building that will have students without masks on. And we certainly have to think about what the delivery of lunch looks like with COVID, right? Is it in individual classrooms? Where is the best space in every building to execute lunch if we can't figure out how to do it safely or with the least impact on the schedule of academic subjects? So I guess that's something we have to continue to have a discussion about.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. And then finally, Doctor, I completely agree and understand the challenge, as we always have, with students shifting from the, what their educational preference is now to deciding to come back in person in January.
We lost Mr. Kokoris. Can you hear me, Mr.
I
Devon?
can hear you, sir.
Okay.
Okay. Well, he did go over some of his concerns
Yep.
Going forward. Obviously, some of the operational and, shall we say, the distancing, getting that all on the, shall we say, the same footing as far as distances. Who would we talk to as far as distancing on buses?
We could check in with the state. I'm not aware that they've given any additional guidance on that. So, I think that they have been saying everything's guidance. And so that's what kind of makes it tough, right? Everything can't be guidance. Some things have to be, kind of set in place. But, I feel better about the possibility of increasing the capacity on our buses because our kids aren't on our buses for too long. And we can have the windows cracked and they're wearing masks. I think we can, that to me is something that I think we can accomplish. It may not be 2 to every single seat, or we might skip a row here or there or whatever, but I think that's something that we can come up with a plan for how we think we can accomplish it, and then run it by some people. But generally the state would tell us that it's our decision.
Okay. Mr. Kokoris, are you back? Okay. I believe he left and he's going to come back, I guess.
Yeah.
I think we can give him a few moments. Great, my binder just went down. Okay, I'm back with that. Ms. Saros, do you have any other comments or questions at this time?
Sorry, I guess we all,
Okay, you're back.
You froze, but I don't know exactly what happened, so I don't know where you lost me.
You were asking, I believe something, you had gone over your concerns with lunch and things such as that. I think you were gonna go towards, well, if I believe correctly, we talked about, who we would talk to on the state level as far as new norms on the bus routes and things such as that. To which the good doctor said that, because the children are not on there for that long, that, keeping our safety protocols probably easier with the windows open and things such as that. That's what we
Okay.
were.
Okay. Was that your question?
Well, it was a comment. I was my
Okay.
question at some point in time. And if you'll indulge me a little bit, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely.
We know that months ago, we were asking the state and DESE and some of the other alphabet soup people, for guidance, and they shrugged their shoulders. And if anything's been really consistent, it's that we have been the people that have been driving things. We are the people that have been making decisions for our district, and we'll just keep doing that. Yes, we'll ask for certain guidances and things like that. I mean, I think it's foolhardy for us to just, dismiss everything they have out of turn. But it's my personal opinion that rather than waiting and listening to people that perhaps may have a political agenda, that it's in our best interest to take what we think is a common sense approach and going forward like I believe that we have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Devon. Any other comments or questions?
I would just want to, we've talked about this before too. I mean, anything can happen, things can change. When we come back in January, let's say something's happened that we can't get back full in person. Our goal is to have a backup option, or I hate to say plan B, but to be able to increase the in-person instruction more than what we're doing now, and also to position ourselves so that we could shift to continue to expand in-person learning. So, kind of a little bit of a reset button so that we can really think about January to June.
Yeah, I agree.
I just don't think it's all.
Yeah.
That's my point.
Yeah, I agree, Doctor. I think though that we want to, again, before we come to that determination, I think we just want to do the work to understand where the challenges are. Do we have a solution for those challenges? And then I think that steers us in the direction of what the appropriate course of action is, right?
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, and I'm thinking about something unanticipated, and we've hit a few things as we know this year. But I want to make sure that, whatever we do, that we're improving the amount of in-person learning with the goal being of going full in person. And that whatever it is comes up short of that still has to be on that pathway to full in-person learning. I just want to make sure that, to me, it's pretty critical that if we're going to make this change, that we do it in a way that increases in-person learning and also allows us to, to have some flexibility around things that could happen and things that could come up.
I think you're absolutely correct. And again, all the things that we discussed this evening, if we can't combine cohorts, that causes a different thought process. If we can't come up with the spaces to accommodate the distancing that we need, that drives another part of the decision. So I think, I like the fact that we're putting it all kind of out on the table so everyone understands what goes into the decision-making process. That, honestly, between meetings, there's a lot of work that happens to get us that kind of data so we can make the right decision for what happens on January 4th.
So just in terms of next steps, obviously we know we've got more work to do around the facilities to answer a lot of the questions and continue to work on the questions you're asking, right? So that work will continue. We have, the other areas that we really need to hit. I think that, transportation doesn't really have to be a priority necessarily of this subcommittee. I think your time as a subcommittee would be better spent on facilities staffing and then the whole kind of, the bailiwick of health and safety. Because transportation is either going to happen or it's not going to happen, right? I mean, it's kind of independent, and we want to increase the number of kids we can get on our buses and bring to school. But if we can't, that does not mean that we can't move forward with a return to full in-person learning either. So I just think it's, for your time and just thinking about the amount of time we have left to plan this out and get it in front of the school committee prior to the December break. I think maybe if we can treat transportation a little bit differently.
Yeah, I agree with you, Doctor. I think the only thing that we've discussed that I want this subcommittee to be part of, because it may require finance,
Right.
is what, if transportation becomes a challenge, what do you need to make that not be a challenge?
Right. Right.
So I think that, I agree with you. Maybe it doesn't deserve a whole evening of a discussion, but certainly maybe we could put facilities and transportation together and just have that as part of it.
Yep, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, that, we could be in a situation if we can't get everybody in one run, we could be coming back and talking about some kind of staggered tier system or something like that too. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, my vision is that the work that this subcommittee does is to look at where the bottlenecks or where the issues are and try to see if we have some kind of a solve for January 4th.
Right.
And, again, if we don't, that steers us in a little bit different direction on each one of those challenges. And I think I hope, again, it's the will of the subcommittee, is that's how we'll deliver that to the full committee. So they'll understand that, we did the work to get the plan to the place that it is, so they can make a decision.
Right.
Okay. Any other comments or questions before we move into the next part of the agenda? Okay, unless you're all frozen, I'm hearing none.
I'm all set, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
None.
Okay, before we move to the next step of the agenda, Dr. Hackett, if you don't mind, I know we've had this discussion and I think it might be relevant just to kind of put it out there so that parents understand, kind of the first line of defense for their concerns or issues as things move forward. Do you just want to speak to that, or would you like me to just, how what the best approach is to reach out if you have a concern or an issue?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's been, obviously we're living in a different time, and the district as a district and the school committee has had to make decisions around the structure of teaching and learning in ways that you've never had to make before. So, going from being fully remote back in the spring with the governor shutdown to where we are now, and I think also just because of the amount of technology we're using through, your meetings being on Zoom, I think that one of the concerns that I have is that we have questions that are coming to you as a school committee at your school committee meeting, your school committee email address, or they're coming to me, or they're coming to Mr. Lee or central office, that we really need to make sure that we're reminding people that your best option, your best bet to get your problem solved or your issue addressed is to make sure that you're either bringing it up with the principal, your child's principal, or at the very least bringing it up with the building principal, because oftentimes we get into some of that a concern, and then that's where we direct people to go, because it's really the appropriate first step. And that's not always true, obviously. And school committee makes decisions around policy. They make decisions around finance, and there definitely are questions that come through that are absolutely right in your bailiwick. But I think that just from a perspective of also our building administrators, our principals and assistant principals, knowing that there's an issue. If they don't know about it, then they can't do anything about it. And that's really critical for us because, you know, we're looking for things like, is there a trend going on here with something that we need to fix, right? But if we're not getting the opportunity, if they're not getting the opportunity to hear those concerns and have those conversations, and then we're stuck in the middle of trying to translate that, it's just not very productive. And I don't think it makes us better. So that would be my more than 2 cents.
I appreciate that, Dr. Hackett. And I think I think you said that well. I think what we're looking for is, you know, as far as expediency goes, we certainly want you to get the answer you need from the most direct source. And in many cases, that is the building principal. And as Dr. Hackett said, there's no issue copying the school committee and copying Dr. Hackett or Mr. Lee if you feel necessary that you want to alert us to a situation or a challenge. But we want to make sure you get an answer as expediently as possible. And that usually starts at the building principal level. So we appreciate all the comments and all the feedback. And we want, you know, everyone is working hard to make sure that your issues are resolved. And many of them are, you know, individual issues that need to be resolved at that level. So we just want to make sure that we get you to the right place at, you know, in the quickest manner. So that's it. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for doing that. I think it's important that we keep reinforcing the proper channels of communication in these times where things are, shall we say, not as consistent as they could be. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mr. Devon. Dr. Hackett, do we I know we have some, and unfortunately, I am kind of frozen out of the Zoom screen. Do we have any hands up from the public or anybody joining the meeting that has a question or a comment?
I don't see any hands up right now. There's one hand up. And I just want to make a comment also, Mr. Chair, that we do not need the executive session this evening. So that's just so you know.
Thank you, Dr. Hackett.
Give you a break.
Because I can't see the screen, so I won't be able to read that language anyway.
We have Mr. Cass.
Okay, Mr. Cass, welcome.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you're okay and staying safe.
Thank you. Yes.
You too.
Great. So I have a couple of things. You know, as a parent with remote kids and in the group of parents, I think there are sort of three main groups of parents. There's the 30% who are in the remote who may be either going remote either for schedule or for health reasons. Then there's probably 30% in going back to school, but want to make sure that we close everything up tightly so that we continue to go back to school. And then there's I'm not sure what percentage the last is, but it's going back to school and then opening everything up. So if I'm in the remote stuff, I've got a couple of questions here. Why are we planning to do this when the infection rate is going up so high? And then I also have another follow-up question, which is I've been asking in back channels, Mr. Kokoris, you just said that, you know, you're always willing to answer questions, and the school district is. So I have a question. I've been asking it for a couple of weeks now. What are the number of people who've gone remote in the last couple of weeks? Dr. Hackett was happy to give the number of people, the numbers on the people going back to school. He should have the numbers, you know, going remote. So what is there? And then lastly, you know, Dr. Hackett had mentioned that he wasn't concerned about increasing the number of people on buses, and I kind of my eyes widened at that point, because from the studies that I've heard is that the duration and also the distance, you know, it can be very flexible. So, you know, it could be just a couple of minutes rather than 15 minutes. And I just sent an email to you all quoting Emily Gurley, who's a scientist at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School, basically saying that, you know, the distance. And the reason why I think that that's important is not that it affects my family because we're remote, but it does affect our family if the infection rate's going up and the school system is doing things that aren't really safe. You know, we've seen a number of kids go positive, or students go positive, and also parents, according to the state numbers. I would be very careful and talk to some scientists about this. And I think the other aspect of that is I'm concerned when I hear things like that, and Dr. Hackett saying that it isn't a concern when it seems to be widely published in the news that such issues, you know, exposure doesn't take very long. So it just doesn't give me a lot of confidence. And then lastly, you know, going back to that point about when, you know, why are we sort of planning to do this? And I think it's okay to plan, but I also want to know if the infection rate's going up, what are we going to do? And when I drive around town, I see so many folks not listening to the governor about the rules about masks. And I also notice police officers, Braintree police officers, not wearing masks at traffic stuff as well. So it doesn't give me a lot of confidence, you know, to send my kids back or that the infection rate is going to be kept down if we're not sort of, as a town, really pushing this forward and saying, look, if we want to keep the infection rate down, then we need to all be following these rules. All right, thanks so much.
Thanks, Mr. Cass. Thanks for your comments. I think, you know, if I may, Dr. Hackett, I don't know if you wanted to make a comment. There are a few things, Mr. Cass, that I heard that, you know, I would just tell you, first of all, the numbers between remote and from what we know, the numbers between remote and in-person learning netted out a few additional students going back to in-person learning after the change. So the shift to remote was not, there wasn't a large shift to remote. I know, Dr. Hackett, you're still finalizing the numbers, but you know, the general 70-30 that you used is pretty consistent and pretty correct from what we know and what we've seen.
I mean, it continues to be our experience. I mean, it was kind of a net zero between students who moved to full remote and those who came out of hybrid to come back for the half days at the elementary level. I mean, the bottom line is the numbers change every single day, right? So it's a moving target. And I think that, you know, our goal is to get all kids back in person or at least be able to provide that opportunity. And I appreciate Mr. Cass's summary of my statements. I would like to just clarify, however, that, you know, when we're talking about students on the bus, the key will be to make sure that our routes are not, you know, over 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes or so, that we still would distance within the bus. And, you know, if it turns out that we don't think that we can accommodate that, this kind of goes back to your question, Mr. Koris, about, you know, what would we need? We might have to put on some additional runs. We might have to split some runs up. You know, so I think that there's all kinds of different options that we can explore with regard to trying to increase the capacity of our buses. And in the end, we just might not be able to do it. And that would be a shame, because I think that, you know, students, if they're not in school with us, I think this is also partly to Mr. Cass's point, or certainly I'll speak for myself, you know, if students aren't in school with us with masks on and supervised, then they're somewhere else. And, you know, I anecdotally hear stories of kids getting together and they're not wearing masks, they're outside. So it seems to me that, you know, us being able to provide more in-person time can be as much of the part of the solution as anything else that gets implemented. And I think that, again, you know, if we're not planning for a full in-person return, understanding that, you know, anything can happen, but if we're not planning for that, then I'm not sure that we're really doing our job. I think we have to be in a position where that is not only our goal, but we have a plan to get there.
No, thank you, Dr. Hackett. And I agree. Mr. Cass, we appreciate the comments, and I think Dr. Hackett said it very well. You know, our job is to figure out how best to educate our students, and we'll continue to do that job, COVID aside. And really, you know, there are other factors that will drive us to a different place if, you know, again, if science, if the health department, if the state and other agencies push us in a different direction. But we have to continue. We haven't made any decisions. We're having a discussion. We're trying to put a plan together. We're doing the responsible thing. Parents will continue to have a choice, you know, based on their comfort level. But again, what we saw after the last change tells us again that 70% of the parents or more want their students in school. And we think that, you know, we think there are some balances and trade-offs as far as the risks versus the risks that the students are having now that aren't able to be in school. So those are all the things that we have to take into account, and we'll continue to take those into account. So appreciate your comments.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes, please, Ms. Iris.
I completely, I don't even know where to start. I just think getting these kids back is what our goal needs to be. With or without COVID, like, these kids thrive, for the majority, thrive being at school, being with their peers, being with their teachers, learning from every day. If we don't have that goal of getting them in, I don't know what we're doing here. I know it's not tough, but I know it is tough, but I know schools are not the super spreader events. Kids are wearing masks, they're being safe, they know what to do, they're listening to their teachers, they're listening to the rules, they know exactly what to do. And we've got to continue to push to this. On another note, with the holidays coming up, people need to take responsibility for their actions. I just think if you're going to have 50 people at your house for the holidays, you need to also think about those kids that are in your kids' class. If you want your kid to be back to school, you need to think about the 50 people that will be at your house. How about you keep it small this year? It's just 1 year. Keep it small so that we can move forward and get these kids all back in school. Just take personal responsibility. That's what everyone needs to kind of do so that we can do this for the kids. And that's where I'm just kind of focused on getting these kids back.
Thank you, Ms. Iris. Appreciate that.
I don't see a downside to not having my family in my house at Thanksgiving. I mean, it's less fighting, fewer dishes to do, less cooking. I mean, I think there's a real upside potential on this. It might become the Hackett household holiday tradition, and we just don't do it.
We're having 2 turkeys, and we're having a turkey competition, one being air fried and one being regular cooked.
Oh,
So
wow.
Oh, boy.
this is our new
hope for that.
tradition.
I hope you stay away from the air fried one.
Yeah.
Okay, any other comments, Dr. Hackett? Any other?
Not for me, and I don't see any hands up, so I think we're all set.
Okay, anything else from the committee?
I'm all set, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
All
Okay,
set. Thank you.
all right, with that, well, one thing, Dr. Hackett, I'd like us to plan to meet prior to the school committee meeting next Monday. Does that work for everybody's
Sorry, I
schedule?
thought I was muted. I was just looking at my calendar, and I think we have school building committee meeting,
Oh, okay,
if I'm not mistaken, at 5 o'clock, but I would like to still see if maybe we can do some kind of earlier, it's
what's everybody's schedule look like? Can we do a 4
not
o'clock?
easy for all of you, but
What were you thinking?
Yes.
can you still hear me?
For a minute.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if we could do something earlier or Tuesday.
Yeah, I'd
Everywhere,
like
Mr.
to
Chair,
see
I'll be there.
if we could get one more meeting in before the school committee meeting. I think that would be helpful.
Agreed.
So what would you need us to do for?
The school building committee starts at 5, so I think that would be good.
Does that work for everyone?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Carlos?
Yep.
Okay. So why don't we say that we'll have our next meeting at 4 on Monday? I think that's the 30th.
Yep.
Okay. All right. And we'll continue the discussion to the next topic on the list.
Yes, and we'll, we may or may not be able to come back and give you a lot of updates on facilities. Obviously, we're going into the holiday soon, but we will be sharing other information with you.
No, that's no problem. We understand. So with that, I will wish everyone, before we take a motion to adjourn, a wonderful Thanksgiving. I guess, as Ms. Saros said very well, a much smaller Thanksgiving, but a wonderful time, and hopefully everyone will recharge and energize and enjoy the good things in life and less focus on all this other craziness that's going on around us right now. So with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second,
Okay, I have a motion and a second. Ms. Saros,
aye.
Mr. Devon,
Aye.
and the chair votes aye. This meeting is adjourned.
Good night, everybody.
Happy
Thank you,
Thanksgiving.
everyone.
Good night.
Good night.